Hey guys, welcome to Irish Medieval History. And this week, myself and Kevin want to continue the conversation that we had the previous week. And this time we want to elaborate on the political structure and conflicts during the period and kind of elaborate on how Irish medieval society functioned. Tell me first and foremost, Kevin, how are you keeping today? How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, thanks. And I'm very glad to be back on your show. I'm looking forward to the conversation again.
Happy days. And thanks for coming back on,
How are
Kevin.
you?
Grand, still tipping away, kicking away, yourself, like getting by as always.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks very much for Kevin for coming back on. I know a lot of the loyal subscribers and stuff that I have absolutely loved the last interview. The comments were very positive and stuff. It's not really a video for proper mainstream, like my shorts and stuff, but it's definitely a video for more of my loyal followers. So definitely, they're really appreciative of you coming onto the channel, and you can definitely tell in the
Okay.
comments below that they're quite happy with the feedback from the video last time. And of course, guys, if you have any
Excellent.
questions, oh yeah, definitely. And if you have any questions, definitely leave it down below for the two of us as we continue this little chat that we have. So first and foremost, of course, I want to get into the questions that I have written down in front of me. And the first question here is, how did the hierarchy of the túatha, local king, and is it the overking and the ard ria? How did that all function? How
Mhm.
did the hierarchy function in Irish, the Irish medieval world?
Yeah. Well, the first thing you have to keep in mind is that Irish system was very hierarchical.
Mm.
It wasn't egalitarian because they didn't believe in equality. They said fingers are not the same length, therefore people are not to be treated the same way. So how it worked in Ireland, it was what I've heard described as a renter economy,
Mm.
which meant that somebody owed something to somebody else, and that was how the economy worked. And how that started was you would have a rituaha, which was the lowest form of a king or a chieftain, and they're just the king of their local district, and maybe they're in charge of maybe 1,000 people or something like that. And then over that, you had the Rurek, which was the king of kings, or the overking, they were called. And they would be the ones who would keep the hostages on behalf of the Rituaha, right? And then at the very apex of this pyramid, you would have the Ard Ri, who generally and symbolically sat in the hill of Tara at Knock Tower, the Tara Nari, Tower of the Kings. But it's not that wasn't as black and white as it might sound by me just explaining that, because there was always different dynasties who were rivaling for the High King position, and you mentioned the Northern O'Neill last week and the Southern O'Neill. You also had the Onachta tribes in from Connacht and Munster kings as well. So at the different levels of kingship, they would have had different concerns, So the smaller king, the lower king, would have been more interested in the local economy, in rallying the troops for going on cattle raids and stuff like that. The more local peacekeeping operations, and the higher king would be, again, he'd be more on that peacekeeping stage because he would have hostages from the different tribes. And that means if you're a Rituaha and I was a Rituaha and we had some dispute, we could go to the Rurek, who was our overking, and we could say, look, he's after stealing from me, you have his hostage, you have my hostage, so let's negotiate a peace treaty here. And we would be compelled to negotiate that peace treaty because we would love our ancestors. We would love our family member that the Rurek was holding in bondage, let's say, or in relatively good circumstances. Let's just say that. Now, there was obviously times where the king had hostages in fetters, because there's a famous quote from Brehon law that says, "He is not a king who does not have hostages in fetters," right, in chains. But in general, that's how the society worked. Now, I learned something really interesting since we last spoke, and I kind of knew this intuitively anyway. But there was a declaration from Scotland in the 1300s called the Declaration of Arbroath, and that was inspired by the remonstrance of the Irish chieftains. So, just to put it into context, we're talking about the time when Robert the Bruce was alive and he was on his campaigns, and he defeated Edward, King Edward of England. I can't remember, was it the first or the second? And then his brother was Edward the Bruce. And what's interesting about that is the Irish chieftains were writing to the Pope. Hmm, I can't remember the name of the Pope, but he was in France.
Mm.
He was based in France, and they were like, look, our system of kingship is based upon the consent of the governed, and that was different from England. That was different from the King Edward's claim, which was divine right to rule, and that the Pope was the one putting the crown on the heads of the kings of Europe at the time, because Protestantism didn't exist yet. So I'm sure that the Scottish nobles were inspired by this document called the Remonstrance of the Irish Chieftains, and that's what led to the Declaration of Arbroath, which again said, it emphasized that idea that we are rightful kings because we have the consent of the governed, and that was a very important part of Irish law and Irish history that distinguishes us from the continental monarchies of Europe and so on.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, and I love how you reuse the example of the later part of the Scottish War of Independence and the letter that the O'Neills had written over to the papacy to highlight the importance of that letter. Definitely something that we still use today to identify our nationalism in Ireland. Definitely something that Sean Duffy uses all the time as well. Getting back to the questions now, and it's interesting as well. Another example you were using and you were kind of hinting at early on is the assemblies. Tell me, what was the significance of the assemblies in the early Irish governance at the time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're talking about what we call in Irish an Enoch or an Olnach, um, and these were kind of the cornerstone of Irish society, in the sense that there was many functions that these form, and if you wanted to draw a modern parallel to it, we would say they were kind of like medieval electric picnics, medieval music festivals, because there would be an opportunity to celebrate the culture, the arts, the music of Ireland, also the language. That's how we have a unified language. Um, but it was also an opportunity for the king to assert his authority, to demonstrate his legitimacy as king. And if an Enoch didn't go well, then the king would be viewed as not a good ruler. So it was very much tied up in this idea of what we were talking about last week, the Fear Flahamon, which is the judgment of a noble, the judgment of a king. And this was the thing, like if a fair or a market didn't go well, it would be seen as a reflection on the king's bad governance. So and also economically, it was a chance for people of Ireland and the four corner, or let's say the five provinces of Ireland, to come together and sell their wares. It was also a time for rallying the troops and restating the laws. Also, it was a good opportunity to hear cases. So you would have a lot of Brehons in attendance who would be adjudicating these different disputes that had been going on throughout the year and maybe couldn't be settled locally because they were so complex, and so the stakes were so high, let's say, that this was a good opportunity to, in front of the whole of Ireland, let's say, um, to hear both sides of the claim and let the Brehon adjudicate. So there was many functions of an Enoch, and we do see some of these functions performed today in music festivals and festivals of arts and culture and so on.
That's fascinating. It really shows the complexity of Ireland. That it's not a case, although we do use within the academic circles the word, tribe and kingdoms and all this. It seems to be a case that it's very much more complicated than simple wording. I remember last week somebody was saying that we're always trying to force Irish into English words and stuff, and it really, the way that you explained it there really does show how this isn't a case of just 150 tribes or clans or kingdoms fighting each other in never-ending war, but this is in case a group of people that are woven in, that have a very complicated society. And your example there definitely highlighted that. Tell me, how did the concept of law treaties regulate relations between the túatha?
Yes, and just on the last point you were saying there, if it wasn't clear, and it sounds like it was clear, but just to re-emphasize the point or to hammer the point home, the festivals, the Enoch was an opportunity for sharing of culture. And that's why the Irish, I used to always say the Irish didn't see themselves as a state. No, they didn't, but they seen themselves as a people. Why? Because they had a unified language and they had a unified law and they had unified customs as well. So onto the treaties then, and what we call okay, there was two different types of law in Ireland. There was Ordidus and there was Cain law. And what's interesting about the word Cain is this is the word we use today for a tax or a regulation or a tribute or a fine or a penalty, right? And that's really interesting because the Cain law was more the local application of the law, whereas the Uridis is what we would call the natural law, the over law, right? So in the Uridis, you couldn't. It was always wrong to murder somebody, but the Cain law is where you would find the more day-to-day mundane things. I don't like to I hazard to say mundane because I don't think there's anything mundane about this period in history. But so the way I look at it is that Cain were formalized laws or treaties, often issued by kings or prominent clerics, and these regulated relations between the túatha. And there's a very interesting word here that comes into play, and it's cordia. It's cordial law, and that means friendship in our modern language. But back then, it was the name for the laws that govern relations between rival tribes. Okay, so for example, the Rí Ruach might impose a coin requiring subordinate túatha to provide warriors or cattle, while weaker túatha might accept such terms to secure protection. So Cain is the word that we use to describe all manner of legal relations, from taxes to regulations to tributes to agreements. Okay, and they were critical for society, in a society that without a centralized state. So, in a sense, you could say Cain is a medium for contract law, and and that's why the Cain law could vary from túatha to túatha, because it wasn't, so long as it didn't contradict the Uridis, which was the overarching law. So, for example, the Annals of the Four Masters record instances of Cain shaping alliances and highlighting their role in stabilizing a volatile system. So I would say that the Cain law was very important, and it kind of complemented. It was a way to have flexibility in the Uridis, which would have been too black and white. So the Cain law was a way to have variances and experimentation within the main body of law, which was the Uridis.
That's so fascinating. And it's great how you worded your answers there. You're absolutely amazing at this, to be quite honest with you, because it really works into my next question, which is, why did Irish kingship, kind of highlight the oh God, it's not coming out of my tongue now. The hospitality My tongue is literally not doing it right now. But
Hospitality, yeah.
hospitality, that's the word I'm looking for. How did
Yeah.
the Irish kingdoms kind of do that?
Okay. And I love that you asked this question
Yeah.
because okay, I'm gonna work backwards, right? And I have a lot to say about this. Irish people today have a reputation of being so friendly and the land of a thousand welcomes. Okay, but would you be surprised if I told you that that's because it was once illegal not to be hospitable in Ireland? It was actually against the law. So, and I think you'll find that in other cultures around the world as well. Like I know Greece is very hospitable. Romans are very hospitable. I mean, ancient Greeks and ancient Romans. I don't know about today so much, but anyway. And so, yeah, and I think that these. Hold on, let me just get my thoughts together here. So there was an expectation in early Ireland that you should give hospitality to travelers. Okay, and this was a responsibility on the whole of the people, on the whole of the túatha. Um, but then what happened was these what they did to address that was that they had free hostels that you could travel from one end of the country to another and you could stay for free and you would be fed and you would be entertained and you'd be given a good bed, and that was the way for the community to provide hospitality for travelers. They basically outsourced it to one man or family whose responsibility it was to provide hospitality. Now, and I'll tell you why that is, because nobody wanted to be embarrassed.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted to send a traveler away with the words on his lips that, like, they didn't take care of me, they didn't look after me. There was no open doors in that village back there. So, and also it was seen to be the um, responsibility of the king to provide hospitality. So ultimately, the book stopped with the king of the Tua, right? And that's why, what's the word for generosity? Flahuliacht.
Oh, yeah.
Flahuliacht. So in early Ireland, you weren't defined by how much you had, you were defined by how much you could afford to give away.
Oh.
You were defined by how much you were defined by how much you could afford to loan out to people. And that comes back to the first question. We were a renter economy, but that was a sign of nobility, that the nobles had so much property they could lend it out to somebody and they'd get a payment back as a tribute uh, in kind. So it was often like the produce of the animals or the wool that the sheep produced, or a portion of the crops that you were growing on the land that the noble loaned you. So to come back to this concept of flahuliacht, which means generosity, and you know, uh, it means generosity, and it also means nobility. Fla is a noble, all right? Fla is a noble, and Banfla is a noble woman, and so on and so forth. And you had the question last week about the fear Flahamon, which is the noble truth, the noble's truth. And I love doing these like etymological dots, joining the dots, because I'm not a fluent speaker in Irish, right? So I can see the dots, and I'm like amazed by what I'm seeing, because what I realize is that Irish as a language is encoded. Reality as we know it is encoded into the Irish language. So to come back to your question, hospitality and why was it important, and it was a key virtue of kingship, is because it was expected of nobles to be generous. And how did they do that? They outsourced that responsibility. In some cases, if there was a feature, if there was an ability to do that, you would outsource it to one family in the village, and they had a much higher honor price than other families. Uh, and that was a way for the society. And bear in mind, we're talking about like 1,000 years here of span, right? So things can change. It can ebb and flow. Um, it was responsibility of the society to provide hospitality, and if you didn't do that, you would be fined. You would be in trouble with the law.
God.
Oh. Hold on. I just remembered another thing I wanted to say. And this has lasted up until the current day. How do I know that? Because a couple of years ago, not a couple of years ago, maybe like a decade ago, maybe more, there was a football match happening in Ireland, FAI, Football Association of Ireland, football match between Ireland and I think it was Austria at the time. And what happened was these two fans were walking, Austrian fans, visitors to the land, were walking down the main street, but near the Guinness factory. They were tourists, so they were going to see the sights or whatever. They ended up getting mugged. Okay, they ended up getting mugged. Their money, their phones, and their tickets got stolen. Once the Irish fans found out about this, what do you think they did? And they didn't even have to be told to do it. They did a whip around and they raised money to get them the money back. They contacted the FAI, which is the Football Association of Ireland, to get replacement tickets. And they didn't even have to be told to do that. Now, why is that there? Why did they do that? Because deep down, they have a genetic memory that they must treat guests well when they're visiting these lands. And so I don't think people say, can you bring the Brehon law back? I don't think aspects of it ever really went away. It's embedded in our nature and it's embedded in our culture.
God, it's brilliant, isn't it? So that's the difficult questions out of the way. Although I think you really set the foundation, quite literally set the foundation to Irish society there, and really worded what I was trying to express for a good few weeks when I talk about the túatha and what is the túatha and my main arguments against the word, as you said there, tribe and kingdom and all that kind of stuff. Because I always try to express that, like, the túatha is, it's a knitted together society and stuff. So I always try to express that. And a lot of people are coming forward now and it's saying, well, the usage of the word in English of tribe and kingdom is us trying to force English into Irish and vice versa, Irish into English and stuff. And maybe we should just keep to the word túatha and túatha. But, that's a conversation for another day. We'll try to move on to more of the fun questions unless we go completely wild here. And the first one I have here is, how did Viking invasions between the 9th and 10th century dispute traditions of Irish kingship and the Irish kingship structure?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I must admit at the outset that I haven't looked into the Viking aspect of Irish history in a lot of detail. So forgive me if this answer seems a bit like juvenile or not really researched. But how I interpret it and looking at this idea that, okay, you make a good point, is that the island was not unified and it wasn't like tribes, but you had this like interweaving of families. Okay, and actually I wanted to readdress something that you said last week, which was this idea that like there wasn't 150 tribal kingdoms, but there were like interknitting families. Well, I would suggest that those families are the kingdoms that we're talking about. Like because if you have an Irish surname, you're probably descended from royalty. That's just the way it is. But that doesn't mean anything, because everybody who has an Irish surname is descended from royalty in some form or another. Even if it's just an acre, even if it's just your little patch, that was your kingdom. And this idea that every man is a king in his own land, or every man is a king of his own castle, that was very true in early Ireland. So even though you had this interlocking of families, within that you also had like, these are my barriers, these are my boundaries. And just to elaborate on that a little bit, like, you as a warrior, you could set your boundary, and depending on your honor price was how far you could throw your spear. Right, and if you had a higher honor price, you had two throws of the spear. Now, so that makes sense, because it was like, if I can hit you with my spear, you're on my land, right? And for the church, it was the sound of the bell ringing. That was the jurisdiction. So as long as you could hear the bell ringing, that was the land of the church, right? So to come back to your question about the Viking invasion, okay. Where should I start on this? I think that the reason that the Vikings were able to get such a foothold in the country is just simply because the Irish were distracted with their own internal disputes. And this is going to sound like a bit of a contradiction to what I just said a moment ago. The Irish didn't have, they didn't see the land as their land, right? Because they knew that you can never really own land, right? On a symbolic level, on a metaphorical level, they knew that they couldn't own the land. So when they seen these Vikings coming in and setting up shop in Dublin, right? Dublin, which means Blackpool, or Difflin, as the Vikings call it. And I did a bit of research on this part of Viking history in Ireland. That name, Difflin, was taken from the existing name Dublin, which means Blackpool. Okay, and they just what am I trying to say? They normalized it. No, they made it sound Norse to their own ear, to their own pronunciation. So that's where we have Difflin, and Dublinia is basically okay. Um, Let me slow down and I'll try to explain this.
Yeah.
Dublin, which means Blackpool, is what we call it today in English. But it's also Dublin Malia Clia is the Irish word for it. So when you're looking at a sign, you see it says Dublin Malia Clia. Now, why is that interesting? Because Dublin was the name of a specific Blackpool where the Dodder and the Liffey met in Dublin. But Malia Clia was the place where you could cross over at it. You could cross over the water when the tide was low. So the way I would interpret that, it was Blackpool, the ford of the hurdles, right? Or hurdle ford. And why did they call it that? Because there's a Dublin in Galway, right? Is it a Dublin in Galway? Yeah, there's a Dublin in Galway. So they wanted to distinguish these two places. So they gave this one a modifier of Malia Clia. So I think that the Vikings, when they came in, they were kind of allowed to get on with their settlement, so long as they didn't disturb the Irish order. Now when they came in initially, so we're talking 793 or 795, something like that.
Yeah, that's it. That's bang on.
Yeah. When they came in initially, they were targeting the monasteries. And they realized, oh, there's a lot of gold in here, and the monks can't really fight us back, so let's just raid all the monasteries. But then they decided to set up like a post in Dublin, or on different parts of the country, like Waterford, Longford. I think they had a few bases down in Cork, all along the coastlines and along the river, wherever they could get their boats into. That's where they had a base. They started to set up these encampments in these parts around the country. But then as time went on, some Irish kings, like those in Leinster, they began to ally with the Vikings. They began to have allegiances with the Vikings. And that was also to gain leverage over the other families who they had been rivaling with for generations before the Vikings got here. But as time went on, again, then as time goes on further and further, the Northern O'Neills and the Onochta tribes, and obviously Brian Boru, they decided to push them back. Now, it wasn't as black and white that it was the Irish versus the Vikings. It wasn't the Gael versus the Gaelofs, right? Even though there's a book that talks about that, the Gael versus the Gaelofs. And Gaelov is the Irish word for foreigner. Within the ranks of Brian Boru, he had Vikings fighting. And within the ranks of the Vikings, they had Irishmen fighting as well. So I hope your listeners don't get the idea that this was like a black and white battle where the Irish were fighting against the Vikings and that was it. Because when you look a little bit deeper into it, it was more complicated than that. It was more political than that. It was more... Yeah, there was a lot of alliances, and Brian Boru's mother was married to So, somebody, one of the Viking king's relatives. I can't remember who it was exactly. Maybe you know who it was.
Oh God.
Um,
We do have Brian Broom has multiple marriages around Citric and with the previous king, Olaf Cuaran.
yeah,
So there's a lot of even with the you see this is the thing is that I actually 100% agree with you because if you want the romance of Viking versus the Irish, you can see that between the year 793 all the way up to around 840, especially when Turgis comes in, who's kind of like the first major warlord, Viking warlord that comes in. And he really annoys Mael Shocknall the First. So Mael Shocknall the First beats him in battle, chains him up, and then dumps him in the river as his execution, which is really interesting. But that's another conversation of why he picked that execution to cleanse his soul with. But once you get Ivor the Boneless and Olaf the White coming into the realm of Ireland, instead of having total war with everyone, very interestingly, they make relations with the Southern Nail and the Northern Nail. And furthermore, his son, Broder E. Emer, has fosterage going between the Northern Nail and the men of Dublin. So that shows straight away that there's a very complicated relationship between the Emer and the Enale dynasty at the time, and that's from the get-go. So this is 200 years afterwards, where things have gotten even more complicated. But at the same time, you constantly, because these are now built-up cities, 200 years later, these have become major settlements in Ireland, so that now these are the major settlements in Ireland. You constantly have a very and I know people don't like the idea of medieval cities being multicultural, but they kind of were. You had Scandinavians continuously appearing who had different forms of accents, different forms of the Norse languages from Sweden, Denmark, and from Iceland. And you also had Gaelic people living in Dublin as well. So it was highly mixed. And that's never minding all of the traders that were coming from the Iberian Peninsula into Dublin, Cork, and Waterford. So you're completely correct. By the time we get to the Battle of Clontarf, they're still Gael, they're still foreigners. But it's now very, very complicated. And furthermore, we have recent archaeological, well, I say recent, I mean 2015, archaeological evidence that show that even in the territories of the Dalcash, we now have foreign buildings coming in. And what I mean by foreign buildings is that how the Irish built homes is by roundhouses. We now have Viking-style homes starting to appear in Dalcash areas, which indicates that we have Viking men who are Scandinavian men, their fathers are Scandinavian, they're Scandinavian, immigrating and marrying local women by the indication of the archaeology, which shows how complicated it is 200 years later. So yeah, I completely agree with you. They're still foreigners by the books and stuff, and Sean Duffy highlighted that this week, that you're still dealing with Gael, but it's in reality it's far more mixed. So yeah, I do completely agree with you. But
I mean, the Vikings certainly left their mark on the island. Even like they named all of the islands around the coast. They named every county that has a ford in it. They named Carlingford, for example, which isn't actually a county, but so anything that has a ford in it, that's the stamp of a Viking. Even there's an island off the coast of Dublin we call it today Ireland's Eye, right? And what's interesting about that is that was always known as Area's Isle. Area's, so it's like Inish area. And so that means like Eru's Isle. But the Norsemen subsequently appended their own word for Ireland, which is A. And that's why you have Lamb Bay and other examples which have EI, or how they would write it is O with a line through it and a Y, right? And so what happened was, when the British came here, that's the thing as well. Once the British came here, they decided to adopt the Viking names because they didn't want to use the Irish names for obvious reasons. Okay, and they heard this Erin's Eye, which the Vikings named as Erin's Island. but they mistook the eye for the eye of the skull, like, so it was like Aaron's eye, and they they changed the name Erin to Ireland, and that's why we call it Ireland's Eye today. But
Ah.
that's never what it meant in the past. It was Iru's Island.
Hmm.
But the Vikings, and it gets passed along. You know what I mean? It gets
Yeah,
passed
yeah,
around. It's
yeah.
like Chinese whispers.
Yeah.
By the time it gets to us today, it's yeah. And it used to be known as Inishmacnessen,
Hmm.
which means the island of the sons of Nessun. Right, so that's another name for it as well. Yeah.
We could literally, when it comes down to the evolution of the Hiberno Scandinavian culture, God, we could talk about it all night, to be quite honest with you. But regardless, we have to slightly press ahead there to the next question. What role did clientage play in the king's political power?
hmm Yeah. So clientage was very important in early Ireland, and because, like I said at the beginning, Irish society was very hierarchical,
Mm.
and you had many different grades of society, and they were carefully measured, they were carefully documented in what we would call legal manuscripts, such as the Crit Gavlach, which means branched purchase, right? Um, and so within the classes of society, you also had like the bonded classes and the free classes. Now, what I mean by bonded classes is that you owed somebody money. Okay, you were not a free man because you were indebted to somebody else. You had to pay tribute to a higher noble than you, right?
Mm.
And or even a farmer who had property and he loaned you property, even if he wasn't a noble yet. Okay, so within the structure of society, at the very bottom, you had Shanklihir and Bohawk, which were basically, you could say they're kind of like peasants a little bit, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean it in the literal sense, um, in the dictionary definition sense. And then above that, you had Kayla, and within that Kayla, you had Der Kayla and Ser Kayla, which
Mm.
means bonded Kayla and free Kayla. So there is bonded and Ser is free. And then above that, you had what was called the Boara, which is a cow chief. And then above that, you had, I think, the next grade above that was a Fla, which was a noble.
Mm.
And then above that, you had the kings and the grades of kings. So that was starting with the túatha, the Rurik, and the Ardri Naherin. Now, there's probably much more that I'm leaving out there, like, and the granular details. But I'm just trying to paint a picture for your listeners that so your status in life depended on what was actually fact, like actual factual, right? So if you're someone today who is collecting social welfare,
Mm.
that would make you a dare Kayla. Not because it's just as a matter of fact. You're dependent on the state. So that means you're dependent on the Lord, the local Lord, to take care of you.
Mm.
But if you are somebody who is like a businessman, right, or you're an entrepreneur, or you are basically able to work for yourself, or you're a craftsman, but that's a different that's a I'll get to that in a moment. But if you don't need to take instruction or money from a higher authority, then you're by definition a serkela or a boara. Depends on the circumstances. And this is another interesting one, right? So I'm talking about ser kela, but that word, what was it? The craftsman was called anser. Yeah, a craftsman is called anser, and that's why you have the place out Ballantyre, which is Ballia anser, the home of the craftsman. But that word "ser" it means freedom. It means freedom because you're not bound to take your work from any higher authority. You can literally just travel with your skills, and you can go to the next town over, and you can offer, and you can ply your trade in the next town over. You don't need permission to do that. And just as an aside from this is why the handshakes came in with the Freemasons. Okay, even that word Freemason, it's because you were able to travel around This is in the old Freemasonry, when they were just doing stonework and stuff. You could literally travel to another country and know the handshake, and you would be put on that grade for working on the cathedral and so on. So I totally get the need for hierarchy. The only thing worse than a hierarchy is pretending that it doesn't exist when it clearly does exist.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, especially the way you went about it. And it definitely leads on to the next question as well, which is how did the Nail dynasty dominate the High Kingship in Tara?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question. So the O'Neill dynasty originated in the north, and it dominated the High Kingship of Tara from the 5th to the 10th centuries. It established one of Ireland's most enduring power blocks. Their success stemmed from a combination of geographic, military, and political advantages. Controlling fertile lands in Meath and Ulster, the O'Neill had the economic and base support to support large armies and generous hospitality. That comes back to the question that you asked earlier. And that was a sign of their nobility. That was a sign of their generosity was equal to their nobility. And whatever you could afford to give away, it hired your status. Because the more people that you had owing you money or owing you tributes, let's say, the more noble you became. And I meant to say this in the previous question with the clientship. You were not bound. It wasn't a caste system. You were not bound to your role for your life, unlike other comparative cultures like India that has a caste system. You could raise your status in Ireland. How? By accumulating enough wealth, and sustaining that wealth over 3 generations. Your great grandson would be able to say, I am now a noble, I am now a Bo'ara, or I'm now a Serkela, you know. So there was a time limit on it. You had to sustain the wealth for over 3 generations. But the king didn't come and give you an award for that. It didn't come and give you they didn't come and give you, here's your title now, as our neighbours over the way there, our very friendly neighbours in the UK. The Irish was like, you had to earn that title. And once it was earned, it couldn't really be taken away from you. But it could be taken away from you if your generations that came after you couldn't sustain the wealth. It couldn't sustain the wealth. So we have a saying in Ireland which is fair acquainted, which means a man is better than his birth. Now I know this isn't really on the point of what you're asking me with the O'Neill, but the O'Neill dynasty split into two northern clans, the Kennel Connell and the Kennel Owen, and that's why we have Tyrone and Donegal, which now means Fortress of the Foreigners, used to be called Tir Connell, and that's because those are the two branches that are breaking away from, I believe it was Niall of the Nine Hostages who they descended from, and the southern clan Coleman and Slí Nado Slane. So they were the southern clans that broke away, but they also alternated the High Kingship. So it was the Southern O'Neills who were alternating the High Kingship. Strategic marriages and rival dynasties like the O'Nochta and Dalrieta expanded their influence. And while alliances with major monasteries, for example Armagh, lent ecclesiastical legitimacy, Tara's symbolic importance as a pre-Christian and Christian ritual centre amplified their claim to supremacy, even if their authority was rarely absolute. And that's really important, because when let's say casual observers read Irish history and they read about the Hill of Tara, they would be forgiven for assuming that the High King of Ireland was the High King over all of Ireland. But that was rarely the case, because they didn't have absolute power. And why? Because there was always going to be rival dynasties and rival clans that are competing for that power. So it was seldom that you would find a High King that wasn't in opposition. So the Book of Leinster and the Annals of Ulster actually chronicle the O'Neill triumphs. and setbacks. And it illustrates how their adaptability and resourcefulness helped them sustain their grip on the role of High King for many centuries.
I think the problem is as well is that a lot of people compare, because a lot of people forget that Brian Boru is on that fringe of the early medieval period going into the high Middle Ages, where we have more of a centralized idea of what is a king. Like when people think of king, as you were saying there, they think of a centralized king at the very top who's got this kind of pretty much God's power over everyone under him. And I think Brian Boru going into the high Middle Ages, he just does an amazing job. He literally pops in just when we need him the most. It's a pity that Clontarf didn't go the way we needed it to go, but it's amazing that Brian Boru appeared when he did. But the problem I have then is that I think the Aenales were a great representative of the times, which is the early medieval period, which is a period of war bands. You know, you have a lot of division that's happening throughout all of the northern west areas, where you don't have kings that have the same authority that they have in the high Middle Ages, when they're much more centralized. So when you think of a early medieval king with all these war bands that are loyal to this the man with the biggest stick, I think the Aenales do an amazing job for the early medieval period. And I think the problem is that a lot of times when people open up books to early medieval Ireland, they're coming at it from a very modern interpretation of centralization. And I think if people really want to enjoy early medieval Ireland, you need to compare it more to what it is, early medieval period. War bands who were cattle raiding, fighting Vikings, who were much more decentralized than they would be when they're going more into the high Middle Ages. And I think that's the problem a lot of people seem to grasp.
I agree. And I was speaking to somebody recently, and he described this tendency as Anglo-brain.
Yeah.
That because we've been so, anglicized on the one hand, but also we've been so wrapped up in the modern continental idea of what is a king or what is a monarch, that we can't, it's difficult for us to see through that and see past that to how it actually was in early Ireland. But I couldn't have said it better myself, what you just said. It was like we have to lose that tendency to try to look at the past from the modern perspective with the modern mindset and try to see how it was for them back then. And that comes back to what I was saying earlier about the Declaration of Arbroath and the remonstrance of the Irish chieftains, is that the Irish kings were always by consent of the governed, but not all of the governed consented.
Definitely. And this, I have to say, this sounds kind of countering this kind of Anglo-brain or anything, but the number one book I would definitely tell people to get into that kind of early medieval mindset is actually the Anglo-Saxon book Beowulf, because Beowulf gives you that proper feeling of the early medieval period, where you have these war bands, and then at the very top you've got Beowulf, who's got the biggest, it's not Beowulf, it's the other guy, I can't remember his bloody name right now, but he's got the biggest stick, and so everyone follows him into battle. That's the kind of mindset that you need in the northwest of the world when it comes down to dealing with Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland at that period, that you're dealing with war bands and the man with the biggest stick. That's how you should definitely look at it. So I definitely would advise to have a look at Beowulf.
Exactly.
Go for that kind of stuff. Anyway, I digress, and we'll get back into the questions again. Why was the Battle of Clontarf both a victory and a massive turning point for Brian Boru's legacy?
Yeah, I think it's another great question. As you know, the Battle of Clontarf took place April 23rd, 1014. And it was, you're right, it was kind of sad because Brian Boru came along and he united the clans in such a force that he was able to push them, I mean the Vikings, back. And he won that battle. However, he was killed at that battle as well. So I guess we'll never know what could have been, what would Brian Boru have gone on to do next. and his battle, his death in battle along with his heir Murchad shattered his dynasty's chance to establish a lasting national monarchy, which he could have done. Um, and why was it a turning point? It was a turning point simply because, well, the Vikings got defeated and they literally turned and ran into the sea, a lot of them. So it was a victory because he defeated them, but it was also a turning point because he died and we never got to really see what he would do next. So it also ended the myth of O'Neill invincibility. This idea that they were always going to be the high kings of Ireland. So Brian Boru shattered that myth, and I think from then on there was kings that were not just from the O'Neill dynasty, because O'Neill were there for, I think I said 500 years or something like that. Yes, and in the book that I mentioned earlier, Cogad Gael Regalov, it's a propagandistic account, and it inflates Brian's legacy probably a bit more than it needs to. He's like inflating his legacy as a Christian hero, where the Annals of Ulster, which were more loyal to the Northern O'Neill clan, right, they give a more restrained view. So his death, Brian Boru's death, certainly reshaped like Irish politics of the day, and it ushered in a period of renewed fragmentation until the Norman invasion about 150 years later, 1169. So, yeah, that's my answer to that question. Yeah,
it's definitely one that you try not to go down the rabbit hole of, because then you're going into the High Middle Ages and centralization and stuff. And if we just had Brian Boru for that entire rest of the period, and if his son had survived and stuff, we would have a much more centralized Ireland.
I mean, he was quite old already at the Battle of Clontarf. So we don't know how much longer he would have survived. And I would say that it's more sad that his son died, because even if his son didn't die and Brian Boru did die, then his son Murchad would have the chance to show us how he could lead and how he could rule. But he also died, and that was like basically the end of the Brian Boru's legacy, I would say.
Yeah, it's definitely one that you can write an entire book on it. Anyway, I digress.
Some people have.
Yeah, that's the thing. So how did the Argarla and the Onachta kingdoms challenged Nail's authority? So that was quite interesting. Which way would you like to go about that one? Because you could definitely elaborate in many ways.
Yeah, well, I think I'd like to start with the Argilla. The Argilla was a confederation of minor kingdoms in Ulster and Louth, and they were nominally O'Neill vassals, but they frequently rebelled or allied with external powers, dependent, like the Ullid or Vikings as well, depending on the winds of change. Right, wherever they could get an advantage, they tended to ally with that group. Their strategic location also. Their strategic location and martial culture allowed them to disrupt O'Neill campaigns. Now, onto the Onachta, which is the tribe that I believe Brian Boru, they competed with the O'Neills economically, but also politically when they were trying to, they wanted the high kingship as well. And but their decline in around the 9th century gave way to the Dalcash, which was Brian Boru's kin. And they inherited their ambition, and it culminated in Brian Boru's rise. Now, both groups used diplomacy, they used marriage, they used different alliances, occasional warfare to counter O'Neill hegemony. And that's recorded in the likes of Annals of Inishfallen and the Book of Rights, Lawer na Ceart, and that details their tribute demands and their resistance. So they're two different kingdoms. They're not connected to each other. The Argilla and Onachta, they may have had alliances, but so they weren't really close to each other in that sense, like geographically speaking. But they both had their own reasons to challenge the O'Neill hegemony.
Definitely, definitely. Especially when there's so much politics going on, especially going into the Viking Age, where you have the transition point going into the High Middle Ages, especially with so much centralization going on, with the likes of the rise of Flann Sinna, Mael Shocknall the First, and ultimately Brian Boru. But God, once again, very complicated conversations that we could end up talking about all night. Let's step away from the Viking Age and just settle back into the very foundations of it all with the Golden Age of Ireland. We know that happened between 550 all the way up to 793. Tell me this one. What was the Law of the Innocents that was written around this period, and how did it limit a king's power in warfare?
Okay, so what you're talking about here, Law of the Innocents, is also known as Cain Odawan. Now, Odavnon was a cleric, so he was a person, and this was like his Cain. And that comes back to the thing I was saying earlier, that the Cain is a word that we use for law, for tribute, for attacks even. So you could call this Odawan's tax or Odawan's regulation or something like that. It was promulgated in 697 by Adolfnon. And how did this come about? Well, it's really interesting. There is a legend attached to this where, basically, Adolfnon was a real mammy's boy, okay? And what the legend says that his mother came home after seeing. I should preface it with this. His mother seen two women fighting in battle, right? And she didn't like that at all because it was like unbecoming of women to engage in battles. So she pressured her son to make this law called Cain Odawan, or the Law of Innocence, which basically prohibited the kings, this was the limits on the kings, from injuring children, women, or the clergy. Right. So there's three named classes of people. This was enacted at the Synod of Birr, I think that's in Offaly. It was endorsed by numerous Irish kings and church leaders. Now, this is the interesting thing, for me anyway. This was the first example of a law being enacted where the injured party was not necessarily the injured party. What do I mean by that? I mean that the church could step in as an injured party and collect a fine on behalf of an injured party. And that's essentially what we have today with Irish criminal law. And just for those who are not aware of this, I know this because I've studied law, and I know that when I heard this, when I was studying law, I was like, that's crazy, because a criminal law is not, there's no injured party in criminal law. The injured party is society as a whole. And that's why the DPP, the District of Public the Director of Public Prosecutions, they step in and take the case on behalf of the injured party. Well, this was Cain Odawan was I would say the original law that allowed for a third party to step in, because I maybe didn't mention this in the past, but it was in the Brehon law, the injured party took the case. So if there was no injury, there was no case. So why is this all relevant? Because the church seen this as an opportunity to step in and collect fines on behalf of an injured party, in the exact same way that the state is stepping in now and collecting fines on behalf of an injured party. And the injured party is not even a part of the case, maybe a victim impact statement or something like that. But and that's why you can actually you could if you have a shop and somebody comes in and steals from your shop, you would call the police. The police would arrest that person and they would prosecute that person, but then you're still out of pocket. You haven't gotten your compensation back,
Mm.
because when they do the criminal law, um, you're not getting that compensation. Like, it doesn't come to you as the injured party. What you would need to do is to also sue them for loss of property, for criminal trespass, right? So I'm just teasing this out here a little bit. Back to the kind of non. I just wanted to add that context in there. This law aligned kingship with Christian morality, and it compelled rulers to balance martial prowess with ethical governance.
Mm.
Some people describe this as the first humanitarian law. Why? Because it compelled the kings to have ethical governance, as I just mentioned, but also to restrain themselves when they're being violent, so that they wouldn't kill children, or if they did kill children, there would be a legal consequence. So we can debate on is this a good thing or a bad thing, and we could probably have a pretty lively discussion about that. Um, but and that's why I'm saying it's both. Like, it was also, aside from the opportunity that the church saw to step in on behalf of an injured party, it also protected those injured parties. So that this probably wouldn't be able to happen if at the time Christianity wasn't so powerful or wasn't so influential on the island.
Mm.
Um, so the Annals of Ulster note that its re-promulgation in later centuries underscores its lasting impact in moderating the violent underpinnings of Irish kingship. So that's the law of innocence. I could go a little bit deeper into it if you wanted me to, because I've given this a lot of thought.
Mm.
But yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely something we could talk all night about it, because it's such an important piece of documentation that really does show how complicated and advanced the thought process and the law was in Ireland during the period of the Golden Age of Ireland, between 550 all the way up to 793. And it's something that in the next interview with you, I would love to delve in deeper, especially when we cover the likes of religion, rituals, and symbolism. So definitely, guys, look out for that one, because this week we were very focused on the Viking Age. Next week I want to focus more on the Golden Age of Ireland, especially with the Saint Kieran and the likes of the High King Dermot MacCurbal and all that kind of stuff. So definitely look forward to that. And also, I'll be having a video call with Connor, where we'll also be discussing the military history to do with the Golden Age of Ireland as well. So definitely look out for that video as well. Other than that, guys, I just want to thank Kevin for once again coming on to my channel. It's absolutely amazing to have you on, because a lot of people always have this view of me, because I'm absolutely up in the air. Like, I have these massive, huge conversations about these massive campaigns and the deep philosophy that was going on with many of these characters and stuff, where I feel, Kevin, you bring it right down to the foundations and right back down to earth again, with basically, putting down the law. It's great to have all these great ideas and stuff about how early medieval life worked, but if we don't understand the ins and out of modern day society, then how are we ever able to put our feet into their shoes and understand exactly what's going on at that specific period? So once again, Kevin, I just want to literally thank you for not only coming onto the channel today, but doing all the work that you have done within the YouTube society. So thank you so much, Kevin, for that.
You're very welcome. I really enjoy doing it, so I appreciate the opportunity to speak on a channel that isn't my own. So, and to speak to an audience that isn't my own as well. So I hope your listeners got a lot out of this, because I certainly enjoyed talking to you. about all of these topics.
Other than that, guys, thank you so much. And also, on top of that, if you want to support my own work, definitely head over to my Patreon. And you can also head over to the Brehon Academy as shown here in the images. So definitely check out Kevin's page and also my own Patreon. But other than that, guys, thanks very much, and slán go bhaile.
Slán.